We want these animals to continue to survive and have their habitat, because their habitat is the habitat that I like to go play in.
Recreation, as even done incredibly carefully, has an impact.
With winter recreation and mountain town populations booming, more people are recreating in sensitive wildlife habitat. That raises a tricky question. When land managers decide to close a trail or restrict access, what evidence do they use to make that call? Often, those decisions rely on research from studies done somewhere else, in different places with different conditions. And that can make it difficult for land managers and wildlife advocates to explain those decisions to the public. It also leads to some bigger questions. Is there such a thing as enough wildlife habitat? What about enough trails or outdoor recreation access? And how do we balance these sometimes competing uses of public lands?
Welcome back to Season 2 of Trail Break Radio, the Winter Wildlands Alliance podcast. I'm Emily Scott.
And I'm Annika Williams.
This season is an 8-part series featuring recorded conversations from Winter Wildlands Alliance's 11th Biennial Grassroots Advocacy Conference, held last September at the University of Washington's Pack Forest near Mount Rainier.
And thanks to our conference sponsors, we're able to share these conversations beyond the room.
We don't always realize it, but playing outside can have big impacts on animals throughout the entire year. In today's episode, we explore how to balance recreation with wildlife habitat.
For example, wolverines rely on snowy habitats to den, rest, and eat. But research shows that wolverines strongly avoid areas with lots of human activity. So, as much as we love backcountry skiing and tromping through the woods on snowshoes, it's important that we consider the creatures we share these wintry landscapes with.
We are joined by Cal Waichler, Project Coordinator at Cascades Wolverine Project, Joel Sisolak from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Trevor Kostanich, American Mountain Guides Association Certified Ski Guide and Author, and Kurt Hellman, Wildlife Recreation Coexistence Senior Coordinator at Conservation Northwest, to discuss approaches to balancing recreation and wildlife habitat, which can sometimes be in competition on public lands.
This episode definitely made me reflect on all the different creatures we share our snowy landscapes with, whether they are visible or not.
With that, let's dive in. Listen while you're waxing your skis, getting ready for work, or making dinner, and tune in for more conversations to come.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Kurt Hellman. I'm based out of Seattle. I work for a nonprofit called Conservation Northwest. In short, we're all about wildlife and wildlands across Washington State and southern British Columbia. My position at that organization was born out of recreation concerns on wildlife and wildlands in Washington State. So this topic from the last panel and the topic for this panel is near and dear to my heart. And probably a confession right out of the gate here is I'm not a scientist. I am an outdoor recreationist by trade. I find so much of my recharge to continue conservation work comes from my time outside, and particularly in snowscapes. And just out of a show of hands, who likes to enjoy snowscapes here in Washington and beyond? Yeah, I think a lot of us, clearly agree with that sentiment. And I think our goal for this panel is to welcome people into this very honest conversation. We don't want to admonish or finger point recreation. I think we need to think creatively and honestly about how we do recreation in a way that can allow our wildlife to thrive here in Washington State. So our panel title is Big Enough for the Both of Us, balancing recreation and wildlife habitat. I think that first question, big enough for the both of us, I think, yes. And we need to be very smart about how we do that. So I think that's our panel today is a continuation of the earlier panel, which thanks for Joel, Libby, Sarah, Ezekiel, and Betsy for putting together. But we kind of are going to take a different angle to it of, so where do we go from here? Where does the rubber meet the road? Knowing what we know about recreation impacts on wildlife and sensitive natural resources on public lands and tribal interest on public lands, like where do we go from here? Where do we go in terms of a culture, community shift, in terms of locally based, place-based visitor use management? And how do we kind of get wildlife on folks' mind as we get out to awesome snowscapes here in the Cascades and beyond? Probably, yeah, without further ado, I'll let our panelists introduce themselves, and we'll just hop into a series of questions and leave some time, good time for some Q&A afterwards. So let's go right down the line.
Thank you, Kurt, for the introduction and just the honor to be here. I'm grateful to be in the room with a lot of like-minded snow recreationalists and excited to continue my learning process. My name is Trevor Kostanich. I am here today as a backcountry ski guide. That is primarily what I'm doing with my life today. I do have a previous career in mountain planning, and actually back when NEPA work was pretty good in the early 2000s, specific to Summit at Snoqualmie. I think it's probably where I first came across Libby, even whether her and I know that or not. And yeah, I live in North Bend, and I do most of my work actually in the busy area of Snoqualmie Pass, which is getting busier, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, and especially in a panel tomorrow with access. And yeah, I love connecting people to the snowscape and learning how to do that more responsibly all the time.
An honor to be here as well. My name is Cal Waichler. I'm from the Methow Valley in north central Washington, and I work for the Cascades Wolverine project as project coordinator. And we're a very small, scrappy, grassroots project supporting Wolverine recovery throughout in the Washington Cascades and connecting science, storytelling, and recreation to benefit both people and wildlife. So we're kind of a bridge organization. And yeah, the Wolverine is a sort of a niche animal, but I think it symbolizes a lot of concerns and values and climate change impacts to the mountain ecosystem and concerns that recreationists share. So yeah, it's great to have a presence in this conversation.
Hi, I'm still Joel Sisolak with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Lest anyone worry, I'm not the only employee of the department. But my colleague unfortunately had some health challenges this week, so I am subbing in for her, and we'll be talking about the Methow, and hopefully some of you, if you're from Washington or you visited Washington, have been up there. It's beautiful.
Great. Thank you to our panelists, and I will say it's an honor to have Joel, Cal, and Trevor here today. So I think for species, particularly like those big charismatic species in the Cascades, like mountain goats, moose, a little bit more on the eastern slopes of the Cascades, mule deer, bighorn sheep, ptarmigan, wolverines, like winter is, for a lot of these animals, particularly the ungulates, the hooved mammals of that group, operate on pretty razor-thin caloric margins to survive the winter and early spring. So energy reserves are pretty low, food is scarce, and every bit of energy matters. And these animals, or at least most of these animals, survive by essentially staying still and teetering right on the edge of that starvation to last through into the greener part of spring, where they can start to eat more voluminous resources. And human activity, as we've learned earlier this morning, even small disturbances can cause animals to expend this precious energy margin that can easily pose risks that can seriously impact survival into the summer, successful reproduction, and even just use of critical habitat for wildlife. So I think in the kind of grander picture of this, I want to start by saying collecting information about winter wildlife is really hard. It's pretty laborious and money-intensive work to see what wildlife are doing during the winter, where they are, and how they're doing. And so I want to focus on the wolverine for a question here. It's one of the more rare and elusive critters in the Cascades. And this question is going to be for Cal here. Can you tell us more about the monitoring and the partnerships for monitoring the wolverine that make the biggest difference in filling knowledge gaps about the wolverine during the winter time? And what specifically should we know about the wolverine? And maybe you could specify any impacts that the wolverine face from increasing or more intense backcountry recreation.
Thanks, Kurt. So wolverines are the species that's tied to the mountain ecosystem. They're sort of an indicator for mountain ecosystem health because they both depend on snow for hunting, travel, caching food, and essentially reproduction. And so they're tied to snow, and climate change is going to impact them a lot. But they're also undergoing this repopulation of the Washington Cascades and the lower 48 after they were totally extirpated from the lower 48 in the early 20th century due to carnivore targeting, like mainly targeted at wolves, but it ended up affecting wolverines greatly. So our monitoring today in the Cascades, they're in the highest, remotest, snowiest parts of the mountains, which are very difficult to monitor, and it takes a wide network of tribal entities, NGOs, agencies, and then community organizations like the Cascades Wolverine Project to tackle different patches of that landscape and understand where wolverines are, put up camera traps, get genetic samples. And in addition to that more formal monitoring effort in the Cascades, we have a community science network of primarily skiers, snowmobilers, hunters, hikers, where we encourage community submissions of wolverine observations or potential wolverine tracks. And we review those and pass on those that can be confirmed to Washington's verifiable wolverine database, so the more formal research group. And yeah, community observations definitely play an outsized role here in Washington for understanding where wolverines are, because there are so many more hunters and skiers and hikers than there are researchers. And they get out a lot further and a lot more often than researchers do putting up static monitoring stations. And for context, wolverines haven't been collared in this state for over 10 years due to the budget that's required and the invasiveness of collaring wildlife. So we are in the early stages of understanding backcountry recreation impacts on wildlife. There's been amazing studies in British Columbia and Montana, Idaho that show us, context is important. Like the main threat and the main reason that wolverines are now on the endangered species list is climate change. But recreation and disturbance pose a secondary threats and affect wolverines in different ways. So some of the findings there are that wolverine population density declines with increasing recreation and increasing road density. Not super surprising. Wolverines at some scales will tolerate winter recreation disturbance, but different types of recreation and different intensities and over different time scales will result in functional habitat loss. And the most critical piece there is if it's pushing a female out of her denning area. So we're still learning a lot about where reproductive success in the wolverines happens. But one good finding to take away is that spatially predictable or linear winter travel is probably perceived as less risky to wolverines. So snowmobiling on a road or hiking on a trail versus off-trail dispersed travel is a little like more predictable to wolverines. So our takeaway from that for recreationists is like the wolverine is thriving in these remote roadless areas. Go roadless rule, with plenty of snow. And those are areas that we totally cherish visiting, but our responsibility to recreate well in those areas is heightened. And we're all in relationship to wildlife, whether we know it or not, through climate impacts, through land use impacts, whether you're in the mountains next to a wolverine or in the city, we all have impacts on wildlife. And I think learning about them, connecting with each other through them is a really enriching element of how we recreate and understand our home.
Very well said, Cal. Thanks for sharing that. And I do appreciate you naming that climate change is kind of the looming factor when we're talking about wildlife conservation in the future, and particularly for the story of Wolverine. So thank you for sharing that and more. Next, I want to kind of ask Trevor about the lay of the land here in the Washington snow scene. Trevor, you're an accomplished skier and ski guide with a really strong passion for conservation. So what's your sense of the lay of the land here in Washington? And I wonder if you could find a way to also braid in ski culture. As some of us might be very intimately familiar, ski culture is kind of steeped in partnerships or mentorship. And, how do those connections become a force for incorporating wildlife-friendly behavior?
Cool. Thanks, Kurt. Well, the lay of the land, I think just to back up very quickly, there's, on behalf of the general ski community, there's pressures coming at us from lots of different sides right now, and upmost is climate change. So that's kind of the D5 avalanche that we know is coming at us, and we're still not sure how we can escape it. But we're committed to trying to do what we can. So know that we're already like passion driven on something that objectively is dying. So there's that's kind of a big buzzkill to start with. Then there's access, whether that's parking, whether that's different locations to get into the wilderness. We're not undersupplied here in the North Cascades. We have tons of, actually very fortunate to have lots of roadless as of today. And our challenge really is where can we access that? I'm going to save that. There's a great panel tomorrow that's really going to dive more into access. Lay of the land, I think, is really interesting when it comes to wildlife and the backcountry ski community. Because one, we think we're actually pretty good at leave no trace. Just naturally, we're like, hey, we're on the snow. It snowed last night. You can't even see where I was. And I think we're finally getting kind of through some education that we do have impact. And in fact, as much as we love dispersed recreation, we're learning that has, as Cal shared, a more heightened impact, especially on a wolverine or some of the bigger ungulates. So the backcountry ski community is quite educated, and most of them are actually quite passionate in conservation. We want to continue to be able to do what we love to do, so we know we need to collaborate and figure out how to do that. So I think we're at a really neat time to be thinking creatively. The mentorship, there's lots of opportunities and there is a lot of passed on education, and especially in my role as a guide, it still seems easier to sell trips based on powder, but for those that love to ski in the Cascades, that's becoming a little more rare. And the truth is, we're really just connecting people to a landscape, and our guests are seeing that, and that's what they're walking away with the most appreciation for. So a lot of us, I think, even though we're maybe out in the field doing the right things, we're still struggling a little bit, social pressure-wise, to be advertising that as good as we could. But I will say there's a lot of good guides that are on an individual basis, really helping mentor through the right role modeling that way. The end of your question, Kurt, it talked about how, is that mentorship and partnership in ski culture, could that even be more effective than maybe like policy? And I think ultimately, no, we need policy, but the mentorship and the partnership, I think, is fantastic for us to start educating our guests and the general public to be on board when policy is going to happen. Because as much as some of us might be able to do okay some of the times, I think as the population increases, we need policy.
I appreciate you mentioning that, Trevor. I did hear a quote. I'm gonna maybe butcher it, but culture can eat policy for breakfast. Yeah, there we go. And I think while policy is so important, I'm not sure to what extent, at least in the federal agency landscape, policy can be handed down in positive and meaningful ways in the near future. So I think it's really important to advocate for policy, but I think the cultural component will remain so vital, no matter what comes out of the policy landscape. And appreciate you kind of naming both are really important, but just want to underpin that the cultural aspect to all of this. Joel, you're still a land manager. You and your colleagues consider all the data across the landscape, whether that's visitor use data, whether that's wildlife data, and you all ultimately make hard decisions to best protect wildlife and fish while also prioritizing human access. Can you talk to us about the Met-Hal Valley, in particular DFW's decision to implement partial winter closures to better protect the mule deer population?
Sure. I am curious, just first, like, how many of you here have been to the Met-Hal Valley? And keep your hand up if you've been there in the winter to recreate. It is a popular spot. It's a destination in the state, particularly for, well, really at 2 times a year. In the spring for the balsam root and the flowers, and then in the winter for winter recreation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a 3-year pilot we're in the middle of. We're just going to be doing year 3. And these are closures, actually seasonal closures of some of our department lands in the Met-Hal. The Met-Hal is the lands that we manage in the valley. It's about 35,000 acres. And it is adjacent. We kind of own, it's almost like a crescent of land on the, down the hill from forest land, which tends to be more of the uphill. And it's really critical habitat for mule deer. Mule deer is one of the, I would say, like, more iconic species of that area. This particular migrating herd is incredibly popular for viewing, for hunting. But beyond that, they've been there for a long time. And the pilot essentially is a partial closure of areas for winter recreation between the months of December and, oh yeah, there you go. So those are mule deer. And I don't know why I sound surprised I provided that slide. So the closures between December 15th and the end of March, and the lands that were closing, in fact, most of the lands in the wildlife area were acquired specifically for the conservation of wintering mule deer. And we acquired those long before this was as hot a destination for winter recreation. But even back when we acquired those lands, it was clear kind of creeping threat that the habitat's being lost. And people have already said there are multiple pressures on those lands and on that species. People have already mentioned climate change, which some of the side effects of that is like lots of fire, which is an important part of the shrub ecosystem, but it's been kind of catastrophic and consistent for a couple of decades. So it's had a large impact on all the species there. roadkill, habitat loss, and outdoor recreation. These are sort of the big impacts. We know that the population in the valley has been growing exponentially as well since 2000, or between 2005 and 2020. There's been a 31% increase in the valley population, and the amount of development outstrips that. So there's all of this pressure. So when people ask, like, well, why are you doing these closures now? It's, better late than never. But the pressures are huge. As Kurt said in your opening, there's just sort of this growing literature about the impacts of outdoor recreation, particularly in the wintertime, on ungulates, on carnivores, on the residents of subnivean tunnels. And, the mule deer are particularly sensitive for a few reasons. One, they're coming down. They need to survive through the winter on essentially a starvation diet. The vegetation that's available to them for grazing in the winter typically is pretty woody. Like there's bitter brush. I don't know if you're familiar with that plant, but it kind of sticks up through the snow. It's an important source of nutrition, but there's just not a lot in it. So the deer are relying heavily on their fat stores to get through the winter. And the less they have to move around, the better. Because anytime they're burning more fat than they need to, it's affecting both their health as well as the next generation health. We've seen, and maybe this is an answer to my next question, or to the next question, but we've seen declines in harvest. So harvest of bucks is one indicator that we have for population, and then survival of like the doe fawn ratio has also been declining, which is a sign just in terms of how resilient they are. And so clear evidence, and I feel like I'm rambling, so I'll turn it back to you. I have more to say.
I wonder if you could focus a little bit on the community reception of these seasonal closures, and then I'll relinquish you from this question.
Thank you. To be perfectly honest, it's been mixed. With the closures, we tried to be extremely judicious in where we were closing, where we were putting in restrictions. We didn't close any groomed trails, and we didn't close the entirety of any single unit. So the wildlife area is made up of a bunch of wildlife area units. Every one of them, we kept areas open, and we did a lot of engagement with the public. We engaged with tribes. The Colville were really supportive of this closure, as were others. We worked with Trail Group. The Methow Trails wrote a letter of support for this effort. We worked with conservation groups. Conservation Northwest supported this effort. So we did what we thought was a decent job. But the local community was pretty supportive. But I think it is a destination, and people who showed up and maybe paid a lot of money to travel to Winthrop, because I can tell you it's expensive to stay there. And finding areas closed, there's a level of anger around that I don't know surprised us, but it's there, and we can always do a better job at outreach and engagement for sure. So some of that's on us, but the idea that the community could maybe encourage others in the community would be a great help. And Methow Trails, I think, is doing that. as well as some of the other groups in the valley. But yeah, we hear about it.
It's been interesting observing. I live in the Methow Valley, and so seeing the impact and the response. Part of it is I feel like there's a lot of growing pains because we haven't had partial wildlife closures in the Methow, basically in Washington. So there's a lot of like culture shifting around. Oh, like these deer that I see every day, they're actually valuable, and they're experiencing challenges with shrub steppe development and the many other factors that you talked about. So that shift is going to take time for people to fully accept it, I think. And building a culture around respect for wildlife is an important piece that won't happen instantly, but for those of us who are working in organizations and nonprofits, that is really important work to be seeding.
Can I just one thing that's been interesting with the public response too, and as someone who lives out there, there are deer that just hang out in town, and they're like, I walk by those deer all the time. We don't seem to disturb them, and it's important. Part of the education that we're working on is like those deer that hang out and are adapted to living in town are not the same as the migratory herd that are up in the hills that are very shy, that will startle from someone who's a good like half mile away. So there's this perception that deer are like, they're almost like pets, which we work against.
Yeah.
I appreciate you naming that kind of complexity that sometimes can be realized on the landscape as habituation. Some wildlife, mountain goats, for one, can exhibit some pretty strong behaviors of habituation to humans. And, there's some complexities just within that and some dangers to humans because of that. But that's another kind of complexity to kind of this recreation impact landscape that we're talking about. It's not always so cut and dry, simple as this. It's like there's some details to be addressed there. I kind of want to follow up with another question for Cal about kind of the culture and how people respond to either existing or forthcoming partial closures. And I do want to bring in the Endangered Species Act. Some of us might be aware, particularly for the Wolverine, it's been a 30-year roller coaster for ESA protections for this critter in the lower 48. It was listed as a candidate species and then delisted, relisted, delisted, and then in 2023, under the Biden administration, gained elevated to threatened status under the Endangered Species Act. So, Cal, I want to really ask you this, but also feel free, anyone else, to chime in here. Is, with this particular critter with the Endangered Species Act, there could very well be some possible restrictions or partial seasonal closures coming down the line. And so, Cal, from your position, how do you see the winter recreation community responding to these possible restrictions down the line? And furthermore, like, what role can skiers play to be part of the solution rather than being part of the problem?
That is a very tricky question to answer with a very conscious messaging. But here in Washington, those types of restrictions or closures around wolverines haven't happened yet. So this is very hypothetical. It hinges on wolverines remaining on the endangered species list. But what we know from wolverine biology is that any restriction or closure would probably be a temporary February to May closure, which is the period in which they're denning, and the closure would be around insulating a natal den where a female has been confirmed to be having kits, or maybe it's a habitual site where they are denning year after year. That has the potential to arise. Guess how many natal wolverine dens have been found by researchers in Washington State? Three. And the topography of the North Cascade, the Cascades in general, is such that these sites that wolverines have good winter habitat. There are so many valleys and cirques and snowy north-facing pockets where they can put a den that humans rarely reach between February and May. So naturally, I think we're sort of insulated from implementing closures like for a while, but we'll see. Washington's also pretty friendly because in the lower 48 because trapping's now illegal, and there's much less remote large-scale extraction than you see in British Columbia, for example, or Alberta. So we have the conditions to probably insulate denning wolverine reproductive females without closures. But I mean, I'm also a backcountry skier, and that's what brings me joy. So I can definitely empathize with the feeling of the place that I want to go to find solace and recharge and explore and connect with the North Cascades. If I'm told I can't go there, or if there's a voluntary closure for the public, which is more likely what would happen, I would be angry. I would be sad. But I think the role that we can play to make that better, we can draw an analogy from the avalanche world, in which there are a lot of people contributing observations from the public, in addition to forecasters, to help avalanche forecasters make better informed decisions that protect the safety of many people. And the more data there is from the public, the more dynamic and responsive management or opening and closing terrain can be. So with the Wolverine Project and our endeavor to collect community observations, our hope is that that can become a resource to more responsibly and dynamically manage any sort of restriction that could arise in the future with real community input. And ideally, like, we're laying the groundwork to have any decision making down the line a place where recreationists' input, opinions, observations are really valued, and yeah, I think another role that we can play as organizations is to provide recreation guidelines that are clear and actionable and relate to our user bases. But ultimately, we're kind of in this together with wolverines as the snowpack dwindles in the in the Cascades and across the West. So, yeah, I think we're better off as partners in this than seeing ourselves as pitted against wolverines. Yeah. And you have something to say about that.
Yeah, I think it ties into the next, but I can.
Yeah, I mean, first off, I just want to say thank you for, like, I think this is an honest space, and I appreciate you, Cal, for just kind of giving us our, like, off the cuff kind of reaction to possible restrictions as they come down the line. And I think what I've seen can help remedy those difficult situations for recreation access is understanding the why. Why are restrictions being rolled out for particular wildlife? I think, like, really communicating and doing tons and tons of outreach as to, like, why we're doing this, and to also, the next step is to share in the success. And I think Joel might talk a little bit about how the seasonal closures in the Met How, early stages, you know, you've only been doing this 2 years, going on year 3, it's like, seems to be trending upward in terms of the mule deer, how they're doing in a really, really hard time of year in a pretty difficult location. So again, just want to say thanks to Cal and to everyone here for just, like, an honest conversation about how do we move forward in a positive direction and invite people into this work. And so, Trevor, kind of maybe similar along those lines of, like, you know, I want us to kind of acknowledge the fact that on the wolverine front, but also with other critters in Washington, is climate change. Climate change is shrinking snowpack, and new land management decisions potentially could limit access in particularly sensitive areas for wildlife. And adaptation is becoming kind of unavoidable for us and how we recreate. So my question to you is, how can the ski and snow community embrace change rather than resist it, and utilize its passion, its creativity, and kind of what you were talking about before with the cultures, like the organizing power of the ski community to protect access, but also to safeguard wildlife habitat under climate stress.
Did you guys catch all that? There's a lot there.
Yeah.
Okay, a few things. I definitely want, Cal modestly didn't talk about the benefits of Cascade Wolverine Project, so I want to hit that up because that is like such a, like us backcountry skiers, we feel like such an integral part of the work that Cascade Wolverine Project is doing. Those of us who've been lucky enough to see signs of wolverines. So I've been really fortunate. I've been cruising around the Cascade Range pretty extensively for almost 30 years, and through the education of the Cascade Wolverine Project, I've actually learned, I've seen tons of tracks, and so the last 10 years I've been able to even recognize when the Wolverine has like surprised me and showed up within minutes of where I was, maybe because I was on a higher call and it smoothly went through a lower call. But the work that they're doing, I think, is like a tremendous opportunity for partnership. And us backcountry skiers, we feel like we are at the front edge of this citizen science with Cascade Wolverine Project. So I'll tie that into like some later benefits. But for those that don't know Cascade Wolverine Project, look them up. Doing great work. And they do rely a lot of us that are out there traveling in these more remote areas to help provide some sightings. Quick note, personally, I finally saw a wolverine this last spring, super lucky, of course, on a long traverse from Holden Village to the North Fork of the Sauk. And not only did I see one on day 2, but saw another wolverine, who knows, might have been the same one, on day 7. And we saw no humans except for the first day, second day. Also saw signs of a porcupine kill that some of the scientists are still looking at, but very likely from a wolverine, and tracks multiple days. So those are the experience that I'm trying in my role to share with my guests, because I had always loved the wolverine, because I'll get into that in a little bit. But once you actually start to engage with sightings, it's just tremendous, the impact it has. I'm going to come back to that to close, but you said a phrase in there that caught my attention, and that was like organizational power. And I want to like hit that, especially with this room, and especially the great work that Winter Wildlands Alliance is doing, because I'm only going to speak on behalf of the Northwest, but we actually do not have good organizational power right now as a backcountry ski community. And that is that's a cultural problem, because a lot of us operate on this scarce resource. So those who love powder, it's like, it's not mountain biking, it's not alpine climbing, where a few minutes before you were there, you could have had 100 of your friends, but you didn't know that. It didn't impact your experience. Backcountry skiing, you know if 4 people were there before you. So I just want to set that context, because unfortunately, our culture hasn't done a good job of unifying. We're still barely telling people where to go to get the goods, let alone unifying. So unfortunately, Will Russick isn't here yet. He'll be here tomorrow, but I definitely want to give huge credit to what I'm calling Cascade Backcountry Alliance version 3.0. We've had a few attempts at this coalition, and I think the timing right now is just phenomenal, because backcountry skiers, we know we have to unite. There's a lot of us out there, and yet we're watching other groups, whether it's a snowmobile association that has way smaller numbers, but way bigger impact when it comes to voice at a federal and national level. So we need better organizational power. Thank you, Winter Wildlands Alliance, for the work you're doing, and look forward to the growing momentum of Cascade Backcountry Alliance. To close out, for me, for backcountry skiers, I'm gonna tie with the Wolverine, because obviously I have some personal connection there. What I love to do for fun, it happens to be my livelihood today, but let's face it, it's somewhat of a very fortunate, higher socioeconomic privilege to be out backcountry skiing. I don't know if I can ethically try to like go lobby for my recreation, but where I'm bonding a lot with this Wolverine is where I love to spend my time, is where the Wolverine, they need, so I'm gonna go back to snowpack, they need snowpack to sustain. I want snowpack so I can continue to have a good time and like have these deeper connections with great places that clearly make me a better person and help me contribute better to my society, but I can still get by and stay alive elsewhere. So I'm really starting to tell the story on, like, I think myself and our backcountry ski community, we have a higher likelihood of doing trips like I just did in 20, 30 years, meaning we still have snowpack in late spring, if we start really supporting the Wolverine. We want these animals to continue to survive and have their habitat, because their habitat is the habitat that I like to go play in. So I'm super stoked right now on helping educate both myself and the rest of the backcountry community on the importance of Wolverines and the work you're doing.
Awesome. And I want to turn it over to Joel before we transition to Q&A here. Joel, you just heard a lot of stoke from Trevor, from Cal, and emanating probably from my end of the table too. Like, what, as a land manager, how do you want that stoke to manifest with relationships with land managers? What do you want? Did that make sense?
Yeah. There was I was happy to see the High Country News back there. There was a story in High Country News, and this is sort of the bad news. A few years ago, there was a story titled "Your Stoke Won't Save Us" or something like that. Sorry, that wasn't intended to be like. I think that the one of the underlying things in that story is that recreation, as even done incredibly carefully, has an impact. And Libby said in the last panel that in some ways it's kind of a numbers game. There's just such a volume of people. Even if that full volume is recreating really responsibly, it has an impact. So sorry to be such a downer, but when you use the word stoke, that's what popped into my head.
No, we keep it honest here. Thank you. Yeah.
I think, part of the, what we really need from partners in the recreation space is understanding. I think that your question about understanding the why is really important. And I think that that's true. And a lot of times I think the burden of communicating that is on the land manager, is understanding like why the closure. A bunch of people have said that collecting data is hard and expensive, and that's really true. In the case of the Methow, we are collecting data, and we have seen positive result. Anecdotally at this point, we're still processing the data, but it's expensive and it's hard. The closures, though, have a lot of foundation and grounding in the literature, in peer-reviewed science. And one of the things that is sometimes frustrating, since we're being very honest, is there sometimes feels like the burden of the proof is on the land manager to show that the damage is happening before we can do anything about it. So the closure shouldn't happen until you can measure specifically how that trail is affecting mule deer, conclusively and scientifically. And that is a really big ask. And I think that we are in a position where we have to do the best with the information we have. And that's often a combination of understanding the literature and the science from a lot of similar places, but also as much as possible to try to contribute to that growing body of literature with local evidence. But that takes time, it takes money. And the time part, I think people sometimes get impatient. They're like, until you can prove that is true, you need to leave it open because it's public lands. And that's a really hard position to be in as a land manager, to get that kind of pressure. So I guess what I would ask is, when you're understanding the why, it's not just specific to place, though closures should be very tactical, should be very surgical as much as possible and place-based. but it's also grounded in this broader emerging field of recreation ecology and that branch of science. So I just ask, I guess, that people understand there's that challenge that we face. And, you know, I'm still learning about the Matao and that species, and it's really heartening to see some of the improvement already in terms of presence of deer in some of these areas that were closed. But we may not have like a conclusive study after 3 years that says this is exactly what you should have done, shouldn't have done. You know, a lot of it is experimentation. So I think there's a desire for, you know, that culture that you said is really key, toward appreciation of science as well as just caution. Like I know in one of the conversations leading up to this panel, there was a discussion of the precautionary principle, and you know, it's probably a different panel, but I think that the burden of proof in my understanding of the precautionary principle is on the people who would want to recreate in an area because, you know, frankly, the deer, the wolverines were there first. And the burden of proof as to what the impact or not impact is, I think, lies with the recreation community as well.
Any questions from the audience? We have about 10 minutes before we break for lunch.
Hi, Mike Crosby. In Colorado, we're getting very close after 30 years of doing a Wolverine reintroduction. This question's for Cal. What are 3 cautions you would give us? I mean, I perceive the resistance may come from the commercial ski industry and the mining industry. But other than that, there's a lot of support.
The Colorado Wolverine reintroduction would be, I think, Wolverine's first reintroduction program. So there will be a lot to learn from that. I'm not sure I have lessons as much as like suggestions. And one is to get people super inspired by the tenacity and the athleticism and the incredible life history of the Wolverine. Like, they're truly amazing. Covering so much ground in the winter. And yeah, just incredible mountain athletes. And they're a species that connects us to the mountain ecosystem and to climate change action. And so I would encourage folks who are pushing for that reintroduction to capitalize on those characteristics and really share the Wolverine story with kids, with skiers, with snowmobilers, with everyone that you can, because there's a lot of common ground that comes out of the Wolverines. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to chime in here too. I would say a big part of the success here in Washington across the Cascades of Wolverines repopulating this landscape has been habitat connectivity, which Washington State has done a pretty darn good job of. We have a very, very big and beautiful, you might say, wildlife overcrossing on I-90 and over a dozen undercrossings under what would be a huge barrier to prevent wolverines from crossing under or over. And so wolverines, as we all might know, have huge home ranges, particularly male wolverines. They can have north of 300 square miles for one like male wolverine. That's almost the size of LA. Just think of like one male wolverine for LA. Like that's pretty wild. And so habitat connectivity is a huge piece of the success for wolverines to thrive in a landscape, is to cross over mountain passes, to cross from one landscape to another landscape, for foraging, for breeding, for what have you. So wolverines need huge interconnected landscapes, and I think that's part of the success here in the Cascades for the Wolverine story.
And maybe one final lesson is that the Wolverine they will adapt to existing disturbance. I think limiting the extent or growth of that disturbance will be really important, especially for connectivity, especially for denning areas. But I don't think industries should feel threatened as much as aware that there will be dynamic management for a species that is so wide-ranging, and their territories can shift all the time. Their denning areas could shift all the time. Just being prepared for that, I think. Temporary, sensitive areas. Yeah.
Great. Sounds like we have a new athlete for the Winter Wildlands Ambassador Program. The Wolverine! Right over here.
I'm curious. I'm going to make you guys get a little more specific because I'm kind of confused a little bit about the mule deer closures here. And I'm like, name names. No, I'm just kidding. But Joel, you referenced in the last time that, you guys have camera traps up there. You see what's happening. You see that there was good compliance in the beginning. Compliance slipped. You also mentioned that you have this burden of communication for better or for worse, not a perfect world, right? You also referenced that it wasn't on existing Nordic trails or cross country. Who's breaking this? Can we get specific there? Because I think that roots down to how you communicate. And sometimes I think I'm a long-time climber before I was a backcountry skier. I participated in this, and we went through this peregrine closures in the 90s, and it's not really a big issue anymore. It was a really big issue then. And so I ask that because I think that when we do get specific about who's not paying attention, it gets easier to actually communicate to those people the cost of it.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'm sure Cal is not one of the ones that's violating it, being a Meta resident. I think that, the compliance issue, and this is true with land management in general. I mean, we've heard people talk about litter and graffiti, and I think the vast number of people understand that those are rules that you're not supposed to break, yet it happens. So I think compliance isn't entirely about communication. I think that there's a strong element of that. I really appreciated the desire to self-police, and we were talking briefly about working with climbers in Frenchman Coulee, which is some people know it as Vantage, but it's a big climbing area in the Columbia Basin. And the climbers were awesome for telling us when they came across a nest and encouraging other people to reroute, or to avoid that route. So there is a very important role for users to encourage compliance. I think we're still wrapping our heads around why we saw really good compliance in the beginning, and then in year 2, pretty poor compliance, and then sort of year 3, we were hoping it's better. Part of why this is a pilot, and I said this earlier, is the compliance piece is one of the performance indicators for the closure, in addition to how the mule deer respond. So I don't know that I've answered your question, but it's tricky.
Are we talking about people that like to make snowmen that are doing this, or is it hardcore people that like saucers that with their kids? Who's doing this? I haven't heard a location. I haven't heard any of this. And for word to spread, on a communications level, if you're spreading word, you have to be specific. And with rock climbing, a great example, it's I look at a route in Yosemite called the Rostrum. It's this beautiful, beautiful thing. It has a nest every single year. Every single year they close it. It wasn't that way. And I think in the beginning, it was almost like climbers were like, could we just toss this nest off? Because it was so, and that's a really sad thing, but that's where it started. And now if you were to go climb the Rostrum, you would get called out. Someone would show up at your tent and be like, what are you doing? And so I think that's I'm asking about some of that specificity there, because I think sometimes this really helps.
Yeah, and I agree, and that specificity is coming. We're just entering the third year, and a lot of the Common Trap data, it's being run through like AI. I don't completely understand it, but that data is still being processed, and it'll show compliance levels. It'll show the appearance of the deer themselves and other species. So we'll have more information after year 3. So what I'm sharing is really anecdotal information. Like, I don't want to be too specific with it because hopefully it's an anomaly in some of those places. But we did see more. We had more encounters with enforcement. We had more people showing up in year 2 than year 1.
And I can speak a little bit to my experience recreating in those areas before the closures. They're like front country, many are front country, shrub step, mellow, angled, but really nice front country skiing when there's enough snowpack. And so you can go for a nice tour without needing to hop on a snowmobile or drive 30 minutes. And they're in a lot of people's backyards or like a 5-minute drive from their house. So a lot of locals, I think, felt like their low impact recreation opportunities in winter without having to pay for a Nordic ski pass, which can be very expensive, was like threatened and overlooked perhaps by that decision. So I think it's very tricky and layered, and there's a lot of people's perceptions on their own impacts, both with climate and wildlife, and just people trying to want to do the best thing. And I'm very curious. That was all before the closures, how I kind of perceived use of those lands. So I'm excited to learn more from any lessons that you pull out of it, and hopefully see the culture shift and people love mule deer, not fear them.
Well, one thing that I want to say before we close is that part of this study too may lead us to reopening areas. I think it's not intended to be just like, okay, we started the closure, these are now always going to be closed, and now we're going to add more closures. We are trying to use the information that we collect. One thing that we did try was with the pilot is to make sure that we were leaving areas open, both the groomed areas as well as areas that are free to access. And we tried also geographically to keep areas available to various communities. There's different pockets of, as you know very well, I'm sure, like different socioeconomic pockets in the valley. So we wanted to make sure that we were providing access for different communities. So we tried a bunch of stuff, but it is an experiment. So more to come.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Trailbreak Radio Season 2. If this conversation resonated with you, this is a moment to reflect on the wildlife that you share your favorite landscapes with. Stay engaged by visiting winterwildlands.org, subscribing to our emails, and following us on social media to learn how Winter Wildlands Alliance inspires and empowers people to protect America's wild snowscapes, including the wildlife they encompass.
Today's episode of Trailbreak Radio was hosted by Winter Wildlands Alliance Operations Manager Emily Scott and me, Policy Director Annika Williams. It was edited by Adam Titmus.
And made possible by our panelists and our grassroots advocacy conference partners, Outdoor Alliance, REI Co-op, The Mountaineers, Duct Tape Then Beer, and Dirtbag Diaries, High Country News, Freem Family Brewers, and our host, University of Washington's Pack Forest.
Our theme music is by Rattlesnake Preachers, featuring Winter Wildlands Alliance's Snow School Director, Carrie McClay. Additional music by Blue Dot Sessions.
In our next episode, we'll continue this conversation with a panel focused on the importance of funding our public lands and recreation management. Thanks for listening and for carrying these perspectives with you into your favorite winter landscapes.